fear, shame, and the salvation of the devil. Here's how life goes. Number one, each of us establishes certain patterns as familiar. A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. Those are familiar patterns for some people. And that's one of the first things we do is we establish certain patterns as familiar. Number two, each of us converts the familiar patterns into an ideological fundamentalism. What do I mean by that? A linguistic construction that includes a framework such as how life should be. Here is how life should be, and then there's various details. Whatever is familiar to us is how life should be. How people should be is whatever's already familiar in regard to people. How I should be, whatever is already familiar to me about myself as of whatever age, whatever moment that such an ideological fundamentalism is constructed. We take the familiar and make it into an ideology, a fundamentalist ideology of how things should be, of what should be, what we suppose to be, what we expect. And this, of course, includes what we are taught to expect by other people, but that includes what we expect, because what we're taught to expect influences what we expect. Number three, because humans typically live around other people with similar experiences and perspectives, we come to form distinct herds, which begin to isolate themselves from other herds, like other animal species and other groups of people. And thus we experience xenophobia, which is the fear of the unfamiliar. The fear of challenges to the ideological fundamentalism, the fundamentalist ideology of what should be. We reject and fear how people should not be. That's xenophobia, when we have a particular set of expectations about how people should be, and then a contrary experience. As we notice, some people aren't like that, and that is not how people should be. And xenophobia is that rejection of how people should not be, the unfamiliar or the strange. That's xenophobia. The rejection and fear of things that are disturbing to us, that are distressing, even disgusting. Those are real experiences that people may have, whether they're young or quite old. People may be distressed by something unfamiliar. It challenges their fundamentalist ideology, and that distress at the challenge to a fundamentalist ideology is called xenophobia. Now, if a fundamentalist ideology is challenged and someone is curious, well, that probably means they don't really have a fundamentalist ideology. Curiosity is a sign of calm. I'm talking about a background of distress, a background of hysteria, anxiety. And then, with the existing anxiety, an encounter with something unfamiliar can produce a rejection or a fear of that just because it's unfamiliar. That's xenophobia. Number four, we eventually notice our own herd changing over time. And thus we experience ethnocentrism. That's the fear of the loss of the familiar. With the experience of experiencing of threats to that ideological fundamentalism about what should be. We reject and fear how life should not be. This is the fourth stage. We reject and fear experiences that are contrary to our expectations of how life should be, our suppositions of how life should be. When we reject and fear how life should not be, that's ethnocentrism. That leads up to the fifth stage. Many of us get so dependent on the approvals of others. We get so interconnected with our cooperation with others, and so dependent on the approval of others, specific others sometimes, within our social network, that we experience a personal identifying of how I should be. A personal identifying of how I should be. So if something else shows up, or if somebody else makes reference to the possibility that I have some pattern that is outside of the specific set of how I should be, then we experience the insecurity of egocentrism, which is the fear of fear itself. It's the fear of my own fear. I'm not afraid of other people's fear. I'm afraid of my own fear. I don't want them to see my insecurity. I don't want other people that are important to me within my own social network to see my own insecurity, my own fright. So that ethnocentrism and that fear of fear itself, it has hopeful agonizing, meaning, wow, I really desperately hope that, some particular thing will save me or something like that. Paranoia goes with that. The fear of fear itself is paranoia, loosely. I don't want other people to see that I'm afraid. That's paranoia. It's also shame. I don't want other people to notice that I have ever been afraid, or whatever it is that I suppose I should not be. So it's a state of persistent emotional distress, mental disturbance, mental illness, ill will in regard to anyone who is not how people should be, and certainly ill will towards anyone who suggests that I am other than how I should be. So that ill will can become animosity, or already is animosity. We can call it hell, we can call it sin, we can call it suffering, we can call it guilt. Again, the basic idea of guilt is, here's a set of standards of how I should be, and then I notice that I am not a perfect match for that ideal or that ideology. That's guilt. In the poetry of religious metaphor, this arising of guilt, or this noticing of the difference between how I allegedly should be and how I actually am, that may be called the fall. The fall from grace, the fall from innocence, the fall from purity, the fall into the state of persistent distress or shame or paranoia or fear of fear itself. In other words, fear of other people noticing my fear. So guilt, I give a bit of a definition of that. Guilt is the repression of one's own life force from the worship of an ideal of how life should be. And then the realization that life is not like the ideal. So there's that contrast. And then I reject life in general in favor of the particular ideological ideal, how life should be. And then I internalize blame or shame for being inadequate to get reality to fit the idealistic delusion. So I have these idealistic delusions of how life should be, or suppositions about how life should be, expectations about how life should be. I'm calling those idealistic delusions. So I have these expectations or suppositions or idealistic delusions. Reality doesn't fit with them, I eventually notice, and I can't get reality to fit with them. There's this shame or guilt, this self-blaming that can arise. Again, this is virtually universal. This guilt typically leads to vilification or demonization of some other. The diabolical labeling of some villain or devil. The word diablo, as in diabolical or devil, comes from the Greek language term diabolos, which means to throw a presumptive, slanderous label across something to cover it up, to hide the reality of it. to, certainly if there's good aspects of something, we're going to ignore them because we're demonizing something or someone. We, in using a term like devil or diablo in Spanish, we're talking about to discredit something spitefully. That's what we're going to vilify or demonize or label devil. We discredit something spitefully, frightenedly, hysterically, in paranoia, in shame. To condemn something, to argue against the existence of something like it shouldn't exist at all. Why? Because it violates our model of what should exist. It's to arrogantly judge against something. To arrogantly judge against something as if it shouldn't be, however it is. That also implies to arrogantly judge against God for creating some pattern without one's own personal approval. God, look, God made the color blue over there, and that should have been red. So we judge against God for whatever detail that we identify as not how it should be. The basic thing there is this ideological delusion about what should be. The natural outcome of that eventually is a contrast between what we notice and this ideal, and then we experience guilt at not being able to fix it, and frustration, and then we blame some group or some individual, even some imaginary archetype called the devil. We blame for keeping reality from being how it should be. The sixth stage, we advance to a further state of xenophobic mainstream mental illness and experience classism, racism, fanaticism, any kind of advanced xenophobia that's supported by a social group. We project one's own guilt by blaming a particular group as the alleged source of one's own frustration and disappointment and shame. So again, there's a model of how things should be. There's a realization that things are not like that. There's the guilt. And then there's, here's who to blame for things being how they should not be. So we then have justification to exterminate that group or oppress them or ignore them, whatever it may be. That's this xenophobia, and typically you have large groups of people who agree about these things. We need to go to war against those people who've offended us or who are a threat to us or who might become a threat. These are the kind of justifications that may be used. We not only reject and fear how people should not be, but it's not just a withdrawal from how people should not be and staying away from those people. It's condemning and aggressively attacking how people should not be, especially particular forms of how people should not be, how people should really not be. These are not just negative traits. These are evil traits. That's this next stage of xenophobic arrogance and intense distress. Very popular. Whole herds of people will experience the same form. So there's a lot of social support in many cases for these kinds of xenophobia. So we then label this group's aggression and the individual's aggression as justified or justice. So this could be attacking a group of homosexuals because they're homosexual. It could be attacking a group of homophobes because they're homophobic. It could be any justification of condemning a group. You give favoritism to a select group of people and then exclude 20% or 80% or whatever of other people. So there's always a justification for that. This is the nature of humanity, really. So we label whatever aggression or discrimination as justified or justice. It's social justice that we attack the wealthy or whatever. So if we would typically condemn aggression as evil, then that's the only time when we would justify it. We would otherwise, like cats don't justify aggression because they don't say other cats shouldn't be aggressive or other animal species shouldn't be aggressive. But humans will condemn aggression as evil and then justify certain cases of aggression with some kind of xenophobic fanaticism. The seventh stage, we advance to a further state of egocentric mainstream mental illness and experience vilification or demonization. Not of a group, but maybe of somebody who's a member of one of those target groups of evil people that we are justified in oppressing and attacking. Say the leader of the enemy nation, the leader of the terrorists, the leader of the heretics. We advance to a further state of egocentric, personal mental illness or mental ill will and experience vilification or demonization. We project our own guilt by blaming a particular person as the source of one's own frustration and disappointment. We not only reject and fear how I should not be, but we also condemn and attack any perceived threats to the egocentric moral superiority complex of here's how people should be, here's how I should be, and I am, and they're not. And if someone begins to expose us to indications that we're not how we should be, we often will respond with a terrified vilification of that individual person. And groups of people, again, may support it. You go to, a bunch of people who agree with you and call them your friends as you reject people that are really terrifying to you. Why? Because they maybe don't believe in your own model of what should be, or they notice things about you and point out to you things about you that don't fit with how you think you should be. That can be quite terrifying for someone to reveal points of shame and paranoia. We have the fear of fear itself, and then here's people frightening us, and they shouldn't frighten us, so we attack them or whatever. So what would be natural at this stage is withdrawal and reclusiveness, at least from that individual person or that group of people. And in extreme cases, that withdrawal would be permanent. Because those people who know of our past faults, well, we must completely avoid them. If we can't exterminate them, which often is not socially supported or even possible, then we must avoid them. Quite natural coping mechanism, quite predictable, quite common. So we reject others before they expose us or even remind us to ourselves of how we don't fit with our own ideals. So we reject them or at least withdraw from them. We may condemn them as well. The eighth stage, we may temporarily condemn and attack ethnocentrism as something that should not be. These whole ideas of what should not be. That's ironic. We temporarily condemn and attack egocentrism and xenophobia and even vilification and condemnation. We condemn condemnation. This is a typical stage, the eighth stage. This is the peak of hypocrisy, and it is a required stage before advancing to the next. Number 9, the ninth stage. We recognize this cycle as a cycle, and we recognize its patterns as universal, not personal. This is the same cycle that people have been going through for thousands of years. How many people? Basically all of us. Everyone goes through this. Everyone is at some stage of this process. We abandon contempt out of stage 9. We abandon contempt as well as frustration and shame and disappointment, and of course, all ideologies of what should be. There's no the right ideology of what should be. A lot of times what happens in someone's life is they'll have one ideology of what should be, they'll eventually reject it and be ashamed that they had it, and then have, oh, now I've got the right ideology of what should be. So they have this, conversion experience to, oh, well, I didn't like Catholicism. It wasn't a very good experience for me. Now I'm going to be a Jehovah's Witness or a Seventh-day Adventist or whatever. And there's this new ideological fundamentalism or fanaticism and superiority complex that arises egocentrically, but with a lot of social support. You have a herd of people all together, and they have great rage and distress, but they're comfortable around each other because they have the same rage and distress, and they don't tread on each other's buttons or don't push each other's buttons of shame in a way that creates social disconnection and reclusion. So there's that degree of cohesion based on we've all rejected our own childhoods. We were fools as youth, but now we've become converts to the real right way. And of course you have people who were raised with the Jehovah's Witness or Seventh-day Adventist or Amish or whatever other fanatical orientation. Many of them will eventually leave that fanaticism and go to some other one. A lot of Amish young adults end up fanatical born-again Christians. Well, not when I say a lot. I shouldn't say a lot because it's a very low percentage. But of the populations of born-again Christians in places where there are a lot of Amish, well, a lot of those people who are born-again Christian are former Amish who convert over to being fanatic, charismatic, Bible-thumping Christians. They don't have their traditional German Bibles. They have English Bibles with modern words and lots of different translations of it. And boy, they just go real deep into that fanaticism of their particular favorite translation and so on. All of the ideologies of what should be. Now, I didn't mean to bring this up, but incidentally, the Bible and the ancient scriptures of many traditions refer to this basic issue. In vain, they worship, teaching the commandments of God, rather, teaching as the commandments of God the mere traditions of men. That's from Mark 7th chapter, 7th verse. It's also Jesus quoting Isaiah from the Old Testament. So I'm sure that there are Sanskrit and other ancient scriptural traditions that make reference to the same distinction. So at this ninth stage, we get contempt as just a universal human reflex. If others attack our lack of passionate defense of their ideological fundamentals, their moral universals, so-called moral universals, then we know that rejection reflex that they experience mechanically is nothing personal, and it's appropriate to their level of spiritual advancement or personal development. We don't have disdain or contempt for other people's contempt. We aren't disturbed by other people's experience of disturbance. That's a pretty important step. The 10th stage, which in this model I'm presenting as the last, it's recognizing that fundamentalist ethnocentrism is not specific to any particular group, but is universal. So we relax. It's never going to be the case that humans no longer have fundamentalist ethnocentrism. Why? Because it originates from this natural thing that we get familiar with some patterns, then we assume that they're what should be, and then we assume that they're what should be, and then we experience patterns that contrast with this basic idea of what should be, and then we go from there. That's always going to continue. It's predictable, at least, that that's always going to continue. There will always be a limited set of things that are familiar, and then some contrasting experiences of some unfamiliar stuff. And rather than learn, people will be overwhelmed and disturbed. At some point in someone's life, they're going to experience something that's so unfamiliar to them and so challenging to their presumptions about what should be, or their expectations, that they experience distress. So there's going to be distress possible as long as humanity is around. As long as there are expectations, there's the potential of violations of those expectations, and then distress and shame and blame and guilt about, oh, why didn't I make reality fit my expectations. I've failed. I'm a failure. Those people are the ones at fault. It's her, it's him, it's them, all that. So recognizing that fanatical, demonic egocentrism is not specific to any particular organism. Everyone does it. It's universal. Recognizing that, we forgive. It's really typical at some stage to be very, reclusive, and I don't want to be around all these negative people. Well, eventually we realize that I don't want to be around those negative people. That's negative. It's not bad. It's just means to reject them or withdraw from them, to experience the opposite of attraction, like repulsion. So I'm repulsed by those people. They, they're a little bit, their moral fundamentalism doesn't really appeal to me in terms of companionship and social company. Okay, not that I can't do business with them. I can buy, I can shop at the same grocery store that they do, and I can sell them gasoline, and I can buy gasoline from them, but I don't really have a social identification with them as we are the people who are the right way. We're the morally superior group. We're how people should be. That arrogance isn't present anymore. And we can forgive other people for their arrogance. We can forgive ourselves of our own past arrogance. It's just a reflexive, automatic reaction. So this 10th stage, recognizing all of these things, this relaxing, this forgiving, this is called by some enlightenment or illumination or spiritual awakening, rebirth or salvation. This has been Fear, Shame, and the Salvation of the Devil. Hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to share it with others.